And Larry, by the way, Larry was on my interview panel. So anyway, so I was there during this 2017 fire. So was the local housing official in that moment, got to know Larry, Jennifer, and lots of other folks in that context. Was sort of heartbreaking to come back to Oregon and have to reuse those skills and those learnings for Oregon in the last couple of years. So anyway, really glad to be here.
We are thankful that you are here. You came back to Oregon and that you're here with us today. And next is Karen Wheeler-Clay from the LTRG.
Hi, I'm Karen Wheeler-Clay, Executive Director for the Long-Term Recovery Group. And yeah, my background before joining this effort was in public health and community development. I was with OSU Extension and worked to coordinate social services in response to the wildfires. And now I'm in this role and looking at sort of what are long-term strategies that will resolve recovery for our survivors in the short term.
Great, thank you for being here, Karen. And thank you for stepping into the role that you have. And finally, Alex Campbell.
Hi, good afternoon. Alex Campbell. Great to see many faces that I know. Nice to see a few that are new. I'm formerly in the governor's office and now at Oregon Housing and Community Services. I'm doing the external affairs for the recovery and resilience section that's going to be managing the CDBG-DR grant.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here. And we want to start out with a presentation by you, Alex, kind of laying out the program that your department has put together to funnel these funds from HUD down into our communities. So do you want to, I think I've enabled sharing, so you can share your screen if you want. And
I'll go for it. All right. Oh, that's not the one that I wanted. Let me stop that share. That's not the one I want. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk. The goal of this presentation is really to orient you all, but also to give you enough information that you could inform the development of the first draft of the action plan. So I'm going to cover the guiding principles that we're looking to, the timeline, and I refer to it as Action Plan 1.0 because we know that we will be revising this plan as we learn more. So one way to think about the discussion that we're having today and over the next month or so is what are the programs that we absolutely want to stand up first, that we want to make sure are in the first action plan so we can get those rolling. I'll cover the sort of the box that we're in regulatorily, talk a little bit about the match between our fire survivors and those requirements, and then talk in terms of unmet needs, because HUD really asks us to do a two-step process in developing the action plan, and that is understand and estimate the unmet need, and then develop program to address those unmet needs. So when we thought about what should be our starting point, we look at the program rules. We're also looking at OHCS vision and mission. The Governor Brown directed OHCS to manage this grant, so we are looking at it as OHCS. And we are also looking at the Disaster Housing Recovery Action Plan that many of you all participated in the development of, and involved a lot of stakeholder input, and also the Governor's Wildfire Economic Recovery Council report, which again was actually the genesis of this group, was coming together to inform that. The common threads are pretty obvious and jumped out pretty quickly. The first being advancing equity and racial justice. We know, unfortunately, like most disasters, the folks who are most impacted had the most barriers to begin with, whether those were language, economic, ethnicity, citizenship, and face the toughest road to recovery. So we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to address those populations. The way HUD thinks about it is a little bit parallel. Equity and vulnerable populations as individuals, underserved communities as geography. So when we're thinking about individuals, HUD asks us to think about vulnerable populations. When we're thinking about communities that we serve, we're thinking about serving underserved communities. Clearly, we want to build back better. HUD definitely supports that with this grant. There's a requirement that at least 15% of the funds be spent on what they call mitigation. By that, they mean construction, other activities that make us more resilient to future disasters, wildfire, or other disasters identified by the county natural hazard mitigation plan. And then the third principle is that housing and community recovery are two sides of the same coin. Can't have one without the other. And infrastructure is sort of one of the binding elements there that connects those things. So in terms of where we are, we're in round one of our engagement. HUD requires us to do a public comment period, which we will do in May. We are doing this outreach because we think it's the right thing to do and will help us get closer in alignment with the public and our local partners in the first draft of the action plan. Paul, I hope that's not too loud. We will be going back in early April to chat with a few of the members of the Housing Stability Council. The Housing Stability Council is sort of like Oregon Transportation Commission for OHCS. It's the governing body. So they will be the ones approving this action plan in addition to HUD. But we're going to ask a few of their members to sit down with some elected officials, a county commissioner, Rep. Marsh, a senator, a leader of an LTRG, to hear the findings from our first round of engagement, and also to hear an initial staff proposal about the resource allocation, right? Most important policy decision is your budget. So we will propose to them how to split up the funding in this first action plan, ask for their feedback. Once we've got that, we would be in position to publish a draft action plan, which we would do in May. I'm going to, excuse me, yell at a couple dogs for just a moment. Sorry. So by June 8th, we should have an action plan to submit to HUD, and we hope we will submit drafts to them ahead of time so we can get early feedback. And if we do that well, we hope we may have an approved action plan by the end of the summer. So the basics of this disaster recovery grant are: it's $422 million. At least 70% of the spending must be to the benefit of low to moderate income individuals or households. I've got those exact numbers on the next slide. At least 80% of the spending must be in the teal counties here, right? That will not be a challenge for us. Those are essentially the counties that received individual assistance from the 2020 Labor Day fires. For those of you all who have may worked with CDBG, other flavors of CDBG before, a pretty significant difference with disaster recovery CDBG is the state can provide program directly, whereas, as the name implies, right, most CDBG is in the form of block grants to local governments, particularly when we think about providing recovery assistance directly to individuals. We think it may make more sense for the state to do that directly, to partner with local and community-based organizations, obviously, to do the intake, but not ask each of these 7 counties to set up this, an administrative function to actually process applications and carry out program. But that is TBD. We have some flexibility there. And again, we've got to spend at least 15% on mitigation. And that can be in the form of making sure that when we're investing in housing, that it's fire hardened and that it's resistant to the most likely disasters. It could also take the form of infrastructure, sort of our emergency preparedness infrastructure itself. Could take the form of a utility undergrounding project like that. So mitigation could be its own bucket, or it can be incorporated with the other buckets of spending. So this is the low moderate income standard for Jackson County, for your just awareness. So it's almost $40,000 for a one-person single individual, or a four-person household, almost $55,000. Unfortunately, I still think the best data we have on the total population impacted by the fires is just looking at the by block group of the census information of those impacted areas. And when you look at the Alameda fire, according to that block group data that, we know tends to undercount lower income people more than others, over half of the folks in that impact in the fire burn scar area would meet that LMI definition. So as we think about what do we spend the money on, the first thing HUD tells us is you have to address the unmet needs in terms of affordable housing, public housing, housing for vulnerable populations. So that's step one. And I certainly think that we could make the case that we can't go beyond step one. Do we need all this money for step one? We also, because there's more need than we have money, right? Because there's more need than we have money, we can also make the case that we need to spend money on housing for folks who are a little bit higher income. For instance, home ownership assistance for folks maybe up to 120% of AMI. We could spend money on infrastructure or economic revitalization. Those are the primary kinds of buckets that are eligible. And so that's where the unmet needs calculus comes in, is they ask us to allocate proportionately according to the unmet needs in these areas. This is just to acknowledge there's been a lot of information gathered. This is some of the findings from UNITE survey. Casa Oregon, Coalition Fortaleza are about to publish some more information. I'm really interested to hear Ellie's presentation later today. We are incorporating, a lot of other data that's from the closer to the ground than the data that we've got as the state. So this is just continue to emphasize that even within the folks who had a FEMA verified loss, right, the vast majority of those had incomes, self-reported incomes, so take it with a grain of salt, below household incomes of $50,000. We know there are a lot of low and moderate income individuals. So what is an unmet need? Basically, HUD says, estimate what the total cost of recovery is, subtract the resources that are already available, and the difference is your unmet need. So turning to housing, we know we lost 4,300 units of housing. What does it cost to recover? HUD asks you to provide an estimate of what it costs to rebuild housing units. It's probably close to $1.5 billion to rebuild those over 4,000 housing units. There were some FEMA awards. It's pretty stark when you look at it in the context of the total cost, how much the FEMA awards total for structural damage. There were some SBA loans for structural damage to individuals. The state has stepped up significantly, invested $200 million. There is a lot of private insurance, but which we don't have exact data on. We may have some better data on before we go to press on the action plan. But right now, we don't have a number that breaks down insurance payments, residential versus commercial versus personal property. So, and we do know that there was a lot of underinsurance in the population that we're talking about. This is FEMA data, and this is skewed because if an individual comes to FEMA and says, I lost my house, but I'm fully insured, in FEMA's term, that's not a verified loss, right? A verified loss to them is something that somebody has a gap. But as you can see here, over 1,000 households with FEMA verified loss had no homeowners insurance. These are owners. So no homeowners insurance. We also know that there were, I think it's about 1,800 manufactured homes out of the 4,300 total loss. That manufactured homes, you can't be insured at a replacement value. There's an enormous gap between what the insurance value was of probably the minority of those homeowners who had insurance. Even they, aren't coming anywhere close to replacement costs. So in round terms, we know there's hundreds of millions of dollars, right, of unmet need in housing reconstruction. The infrastructure calculation is also a little bit academic. What HUD asks you to look at is what did the feds not cover for public assistance? That's public infrastructure that was destroyed directly by the fire. And what is the non-federal share on the hazard mitigation grants that have been approved? But we know there's lots of infrastructure that wasn't eligible for either of those programs, won't go into either of those programs. So there, we have the ability to make the case that there are other infrastructure needs beyond this. This number is going to go down a bit, actually, though, because just last week, good news, I guess, was that FEMA announced that everything's going to be a 90-10 cost share for the 2020 incidents. In terms of economic revitalization, again, a little bit of an abstract calculation. FEMA says, look at the applications to SBA for the EIDL, the disaster lending that Small Business Administration does for businesses, and look at what's the verified loss there. So the verified loss in the 136 applicants was $32 million. A lot of people weren't offered loans. A lot of people did take loans. So there wasn't a whole lot of resource either. We know that number is super low. I'm sure it always is, but in the case of this fire, right, this is a statewide number, 136 business applicants. We know there are over 150 directly displaced, impacted by the fire in Jackson County alone. So we know this is way low. The $10 million is actually some Oregon Main Street money that's been specifically targeted or given a preference to wildfire impacted communities. But I think the bottom line here is we know there's a huge unmet need out there. We haven't really documented it yet. We could, if we, collectively want to devote some of these resources to addressing those needs. So that's my quick overview. I'm happy to, Stephen, answer questions of clarification. The feedback that we're looking for, I'll go ahead and just drop into the chat. We now have live a really quick survey. If you want to take the shorter version of the survey, just answer it as an individual. It's 7 questions. If you want to take a slightly longer version, answer as a representative of your organization, and it gets a little bit more into the questions about the data on infrastructure. And you may, if you have information like that, and you're willing to take a little bit longer survey, please do that. Yeah, we're trying to figure out the the sort of top line, I guess, budgeting decision, which of these programs should be stood up first. And we really welcome your input on that. I won't go into all the other engagement that we're doing, but be happy to talk to any of you all about that offline, especially if you have ideas of groups or ways to reach people that we don't typically. I am working with UNITE and Unite Oregon and Oregon Human Development Corporation on some sort of, I hope, a little bit different strategies on that. I'll stop there and drop that link in the chat.
Thank you, Alex. And may be useful to, if people have questions, to drop you an email as well, if you want to drop your email in.
Absolutely.
Does anybody have a question, just to clarify Alex, what Alex presented, because we're going to go into a whole discussion about its implications now, but let's jump on, unmute and jump in, or we'll.
Alex, this is Kathy, Brian, and I just had a question. You mentioned 4,500 homes. You were counting the entire state of Oregon in that, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Just clarifying that something didn't happen locally, or that I.
No, yeah. Most of the data I showed you all was statewide. So 4,300 units statewide, 2,500 of them here in Jackson County.
And Alex, will you make the deck available, and we'll put the deck into our
Absolutely.
post with the video and everything, and so people can have those exact numbers by county, because that data was really great. That was
For sure.
a great summary. So
Alex, do you collect or do you have data on by age?
We have, I'm super interested in that. You know, the AARP did a phone survey that's got some interesting information in it. We have some general ideas of what the population 65 plus was. And I also did get RV COG shared with me. They had sort of a number of individuals that they serve through their elder programs that they know were displaced. So we do have a couple data points there. Looks like Don may have something too.
Yeah. Related question, the 18% shown as disabled, was that primarily older adults, or do you know what that took and how that figure was arrived at?
I don't, Don. It's whatever the standard census, American Community Survey.
Okay, it's out of the census.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
So the structure of our meeting today will be, so Alex has kind of given us a baseline on what's happening at the state level around this program. And now I'd like to, then we're going to turn to our friends from Sonoma and Margaret to talk about their experience with similar programs and how that actually worked, right? And then we have Karen Wheeler-Clay from the LTRG, and the LTRG is working to bring together a set of unmet needs data that does have some age data in it. So why don't we, I think we'll start with, I think we'll go with Larry first, and then I'll ask Margaret, and then we'll ask Jennifer to give us a little bit larger context on the program. Larry, what's your experience with
I can get started here. Sorry, I was on mute there. I was giving a very good presentation to myself for a second. I was actually suggesting, and maybe Margaret, maybe you and I should tag team this, because we really were a team on this, as well as other things after the fires. I think and I would have to parenthetical everything that I share with the fact that this is California, perhaps the most dysfunctional state government when it comes to housing and community development. Actually, maybe not, but certainly feels that way. So I'm sure everything Alex is doing is fine, and I'm sure going to go over great. California, unbelievable bureaucracy to try to wage through to get our funding. We just at some of the basics. I'm not going to be very good on the number of units lost, but we were successful. 2017, we had the Tubbs wildfire. that really affected the North Bay, north of San Francisco. And after lobbying that I know Jennifer will get into, we were able to successfully get an allocation of CDBG disaster recovery funds. I think they, if I recall correctly, they were in two tranches. One was $127 million, and the other was $90 million that was related to something called mitigation funds. And they did run separately, so that were important that they were such a way. It was the first time California had ever received these CDBG-DR funds, and so they had to stand up a whole new unit at the state level to administer the funds and to learn the rules. And there was a lot of lessons learned along the way in terms of how do you get this program going. First thing and this is not meant to scare you again, this is more with the California lens on it. We only closed on the first allocation of DR funds to actually go towards a specific project, and that was my organization, Burbank, in December of last year of 21, a little over 4 years after the fire. So it took literally 4 years. Well, it took about 3 years from the date of the award for the CDBG-DR to actually get it into the hands of users. And I'm sure that Oregon will do much better than we did in California. But 4 years is a long time for someone, obviously, who's been displaced and trying to figure out how to keep a roof over their head. So I'm really hoping there are a lot of lessons learned in that. And from what I understand, the second tranche of DR funds we got for our 2018 fires, which I have not been as directly involved, but I've been monitoring indirectly, is moving a little bit quicker. So that's just one word of caution to all of you that expect the dollars to come flowing in a short period of time. There were a couple of battles that we waged with HUD along the way, and that was the definition of needs. And that was some of what was alluded to, I think, in some of your questions there. We really do feel as though HUD dramatically, and FEMA, who they worked in close consultation with, dramatically underestimated the amount of damage that was done and the amount of uninsured or uncovered damage that was done that there weren't other sources for. And we, in the end, just agreed to disagree with them on that subject, but it is what it is. We also, the populations that were impacted, or the structures really that were impacted most dramatically in the Tubbs wildfire were single family homes. But the communities that were impacted were disproportionately those low and very low income individuals. And we made the case to HUD that we should not have to go and replace a home with another home, that we should be able, for instance, to be able to use our funds, these CDBG-DR funds, specifically to build multifamily homes in the case where it made sense from a land use perspective and timing perspective, and frankly, from a resiliency perspective, to be able to create not exactly what had been there, but something better that would meet the needs of the community as it stood now. And that was a battle. In the end, of the $127 million that were allocated, I believe about half of those were allocated to individuals who were underinsured, who were looking for ways to finish or to rebuild their homes. And the other half of it went towards building multifamily homes, multifamily rental projects that were going to meet the needs of the population, especially the low-income population. There's one specific project that sort of, I think, points this out that we've been involved with since day one, and that is the rebuilding of what was called, at the time, the Journey's End Mobile Home Park. And this was a mobile home park in Santa Rosa that was completely wiped out in the fires, 162 mobile homes. Most of the folks there were seniors living on fixed income. 5 individuals died in the fires. And the place was just absolutely destroyed. It is in the middle of Santa Rosa, and so the consensus was, which is a pretty urban environment, it's a city, really, and the consensus was that it didn't make sense to rebuild a mobile home for a number of reasons, mobile home park for a number of reasons on that site. And local community, we're working together with the local community, came to the conclusion that really what made sense was to build a senior affordable housing project of 162 units to replace the mobile homes that were there. And I'm happy to report that we've started construction on that in December of 2021, the first phase, which is 96 units, and the second phase, which is fully funded. In fact, I just jumped off a call with our banks and our investors on that one to another 38 units. And so by the end of 2023, we've built 132 of those units, of 132 of the 162 units. There was another, by the way, which something that I urge you to go after, which we had no clue existed until we went back to Washington and advocated for the release of these funds. And that's something called these disaster low-income housing tax credits. And these are 9% credits for any of you that are in the development world, built affordable housing, familiar with affordable housing. You'll know that tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, are really the engine that builds affordable housing. It provides the bulk of the equity that organizations like ours use to build affordable housing. There's a provision of the IRS tax code that allows there to be allocated and funded these are called disaster tax credits. And our Congressman Mike Thompson, who at the time and still is chairing the committee that oversees tax credits, was able to include an allocation of those $100 million worth of these disaster tax credits. Tax credits run for 10 years, so that 100 million really translated into $1 billion worth of funding that went for that went to help rebuild the communities. And those tax credits have been an absolute lifeline for us to be able to build anything to replace what was destroyed in the fires. We have paired the CDBG-GR funding with the tax credits in order to make these projects work. So Burbank, my organization, has been fortunate to be the recipient of about $25 million in CDBG-GR to date. We have 3 projects going that are funding them. When you are at the end of the road and you are trying to actually use the funds, a couple of things to keep in mind, which really were a problem. One was trying to get a definition of relocation. As any of you that are familiar with the Uniform Relocation Act, URA, understand that there are real rules regarding what happens when you rebuild or when you move someone out of their home. There's nothing written for what happens when somebody's home is destroyed in a natural disaster. And so in the end, we actually got no guidance from HUD on how applicable relocation law was to the projects that we were building. We decided to just go ahead on our own, get independent legal opinions on why we thought our plan was right, and we've moved forward. And we spent a year, by the way, trying to get that out of HUD. So that's just one thing to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is that you really can't start work using these DR funds until you have completed environmental review on a specific project. So this really affected a lot of our homeowners, and the timing is what really was a huge impact. Took 4 years, as I mentioned, to get much of this money to the ground. Folks were expected to stand still on their rebuild of their homes for 4 years, and that just, the insurance companies were not okay with that. So these were underinsured homeowners who had to use these funds to try to fill in the gaps. They could not access the disaster relief funds if they had a project underway, because that would have been a violation of NEPA. And there was no waiving of NEPA in this, and when it comes to DR funding. So that was one nuance that we discovered along the way that became pretty significant. People had to decide, we'll do nothing and just wait and hope we get the money, or do we start and just basically take our chances and assume we won't be able to access these funds. So just a couple of things that to keep in mind when you go through this process. And happy to answer questions, and I'm sure Margaret can correct a lot of what I said if she'll have the truth. So
thank you, Larry. Those are super important details. painful lessons learned, I'm sure. Margaret,
Yeah.
what comes to your mind to hearing what Larry shared?
Thanks. It's good to see my friends from Sonoma County. And it's weird. It is weird to sort of live in both worlds for a minute. So a couple of things that come to mind. One is, and Larry sort of alluded to this, and I think in some ways it's even more true here in Oregon. The HUD's programs and FEMA's programs aren't positioned to be responsive to wildfires, right? They're responsive to floods and hurricanes. And so the level of damage that you all know happened as a result of the fires was, the underground utilities, foundations were destroyed, right? So there is something about their formulaic response that you have to sort of say, that's great, but it doesn't really work in a wildfire situation. And the interplay of this sort of underinsured, because insurance policies weren't, very often anticipating the foundation is completely gone, the underground utilities are completely gone. So there's a lot about this that is about kind of storytelling. And part of what I've said to a couple of other groups in the last couple of weeks is folks are really getting excited about DR. Yeah, there's a big reliance on data, but I think we have to balance that with the Oregon story, with the Alameda fire story. And we had, for example, ways of looking at in Sonoma County, secondary displacement. And we didn't have great data, hard data about that, but we had a lot of anecdotal data. And because the agency I ran was the housing authority, we had stories of voucher holders who were asked to move because their landlord's brother needed a place to live. And so they got displaced. So we could weave in these stories that were really particular to our community. And I want to really urge Oregon communities, recovery communities, to do that as well. And Larry probably doesn't have a reason to know this, maybe he does, but in Jackson County, the Rogue Valley, which is where the bulk of the impacts were felt, there were something like 16 or 18 mobile home parks completely destroyed. And so the disproportionality on the profile of folks who live in mobile home parks is just hard to fathom. And I remember you and I talking for hours and hours, Larry, about what are we going to do about the residents at Journey's End. You can't, the insurance, no help. Their home was really old and you can't replace that home that they've owned for 20 years and that they paid $25,000 for. So that times 18 parks is what we've got going on in the Rogue Valley. And the HUD programs aren't really positioned, in my judgment, to accommodate that and to facilitate all the complexities about the homeowner's situation, about their park owner's situation, and the infrastructure that goes along with that. So I think there's something compelling about marrying the data with the local story as you think about helping the state write its action plan. And so that's sort of top of mind for me. I think there's another piece, there was some beautiful moments of intergovernmental cooperation in Sonoma County. And within a few months, the city of Santa Rosa and the county of Sonoma had done really quite amazing work thinking about how do we do differently our response to homelessness? How do we think differently about how the city and county plan for housing, finance housing? And some really innovative work came out of that era. And I think there's some lessons learned that would be really useful that I've thought about and starting to do some writing about how that can help communities recover. You know, there were behind the scenes lots of fights between the elected officials from the different jurisdictions, but putting a good face on it to the state and to HUD, I think, was really helpful and important. And it was the fire event was such a catalyst, as I know it was for folks in the Rogue Valley as well. Such a catalyst to sort of, we have to do things differently. The other thing you've got in your very much in working in your favor is Rep Marsh, and I just need you. I don't need to tell this room that, but I want to say it anyway. And you know, the advocacy I've seen from Representative Pam Marsh for your district for every step of the way. We didn't have anything quite like that in Sonoma County. Oh, we had active state legislators and a state senator who took a particular personal interest. But I think this is above and beyond. And I think I want to just use this moment to say, yes, it's a gift. It's a gift, her presence here. So thank you for all that you're doing in that regard, Rep Marsh. So I have lots more I could say, but you all know, you've all heard me talk, and I will stop so you can hear from others. And if there's
I did
time
want to
for
jump in on one thing,
dialogue.
okay, that
Yeah.
I forgot, that you were very instrumental in getting, as well as the city of Santa Rosa, the kumbaya moment between Santa Rosa and Sonoma brought it forward to my head. One of the things that they fought for in both the county and the city, with the state, and then ultimately with HUD, was to get the money down, decision-making for the money down to the local level, because there was not a one-size-fits-all. So in that case, our state always knows best. That we had to fight tooth and nail, and we had to fight with HUD. And what they did was they packaged the funds and said, you have $40 million for multifamily housing. You conduct the process for how those funds should be allocated. And that was a really, really important step, because you all know best how to use those funds. And that's not often the way that process works. In fact, it never works that way. And so I would urge you to do similar. And Margaret and Dave Gwine and others at the city of Santa Rosa were really instrumental in getting that done.
Yeah.
Making the block grant truly a block grant.
Exactly. That's right.
Great. And so I'm hearing this theme of advocacy, and I think that brings us directly, because these programs feel like they're so big and solid and established, and FEMA and HUD know what's going on, but it sounds like there's all kinds of nuance around the edge, and there's all kinds of buttons to push, if you know about them, that can modify things. So Jennifer, I know this is a kind of a theme you wanted to hit on as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you so much once again. I'm happy to see so many people I do know on here. I also want to say that it is really true. It was just said by Representative Marsh. We work in Colorado, California, and Oregon, and she really is a huge asset to your community. And so it's unusual that she is universally loved, and everybody who talks about her the same way. We love working in Oregon. We also work in Santiam Canyon for those fires. You have a couple of things really going for you. One of them is it's a much smaller state. There's less bureaucracy, and where Alex came from, Regional Solutions, before his current position, is a very great system for some built-in resiliency and communication processes that we don't have in California, and they also don't have in Colorado. So I want to give you all a shout out right there. I'm going to talk to you quickly about advocacy, and I actually have sent this deck as a PDF to Stephen, so you can ask him for it. You can also contact us at any time. After the fire helps local leaders lead and design their own recovery. We don't supplant it at all. And we're also not like Marsh or Ernst & Young. We don't do accounting. We don't do those things. We do help communities navigate wildfires, because this is a new phenomenon like this. We've never had them. We've never had these mega fires so soon and so quick and so hot and so dangerous and so deadly. So HUD and FEMA actually need you to help them partner to understand how to actually properly serve, because it's true, they are set up for wind and rain. They are not set up for wildfires, and we have found them to be very receptive to that sort of learning curve along with constituents. And as you know, in 2017, we thought we were going to be the Kardashians of wildfire disaster. We were totally wrong, because we didn't know that we were about to, enter into an era of mega fires. We've had 3 mega fires since then in just our county alone. and have lost nearly 2,000 units of homes since the 8,900 structures we lost in 2017. So something to be aware of is whatever systems you're doing right now, it's likely you're going to have to reinvent them as you go, because Oregon will experience more mega fires. And I'm sorry for that, but it's likely true. All right, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. All right. On the slide, as you'll see, all of our contact information and where we are is on there. So feel free to reach out anytime. We are here to serve you. This just goes over basically what I've told you before, what happened here in October of 2017. It was truly stunning. And they told us that our recovery and rebuild time would be 7 to 10 years. In Sonoma County, we are about 90% rebuilt, and we can talk on another call about why that is. And it's not because we are smarter, just so that you know. This is what we do. I'm just going to make sure that you have this when you are ready for it. Recover, rebuild, reimagine is our tagline. And we love it when we see that pop up elsewhere in other forms, because we do believe that that is something that unites all of us in these wildfire communities together, is that desire. I'm going to talk about advocacy today, and I'm so glad that Larry is on this call and Margaret. They've both participated in different ways in our advocacy program. What you see here in Speaker Pelosi's office, this is in 2019. A board member, Michael Mondavi, is sitting next to me, and across next to Speaker Pelosi is Charles Brooks, who some of you know from formerly of Rebuild Paradise Foundation. We showed him how to do, oh, look, I'm blocked out, which is good. So one of the things I wanted to do this photo to talk about, you know, how do you go from destruction to humanity? This is up in Santiam Canyon on the bottom. This is on the top. That's the Dixie Fire in Greenville last summer. And then how do you actually translate what you learn from all of these communities into anything actionable that will serve the community that you are representing? Oh. So why advocate? So one of the first things, and Larry can back me up, is that when our organization was born as Rebuild North Bay Foundation, and Darius Anderson, who created it, and when he reached out to people more, you know, practiced in this field, he was told right away that one of the first things we'd have to do is advocate for our community in order to get it not just equal access, but to sort of well, you're in competition for resources, attention, and funding. And as you all have experienced now that you are about, what are you, 22 months post-disaster? No, 18 months post-disaster around there. You see that the attention is already faded. And, you know, how do you keep the public sector in the room? Because really they are where the major funds are coming from until your recovery is actually done and your rebuild is over. Who do you want to, we don't do a lot of state advocacy because, well, there's a variety of reasons. We mostly focus on the federal level. We are looking to change the space of disaster as it relates to wildfire, but we're hoping in general, we've been very successful at getting a seat at that table. We talk to representatives, so yeah, Congressman Mike Thompson's been great. Our senators, in our case, Senator Padilla and formerly Harris, and now, I'm sorry, Harris and Feinstein. We talked to the chair of committees, particularly transportation and infrastructure. That is the committee that oversees FEMA. And they have great House staff. And in fact, the general counsel for them is on our board of directors, who was general counsel for TNI during the 2017 fires. She's actually going to come off and be on our board of advisors because she was just named like the director in charge of all of the grants for our FEMA. So she can no longer sit on our board. We also talked to FEMA HUD, SBA. I was interested, Alex, in your SBA numbers because most of the time SBA, they always show up after a disaster, but for individual assistance, as far as individual loans, in our experience, most are denied. And then after that, if they are approved, they are often cut, and it's a very difficult process for people to navigate. So SBA, we talked to the FCC about communications issues, the EDA, which is actually a largely underutilized group for disaster, and USDA, they all have a role, and they all want to hear from you. We actually get a great reception, so I highly recommend it. So you can do 3 levels. You can do local, state, and federal. Again, most of the time we are supporting local and state at the federal level, but we never act without local and state stakeholders. We are nonpartisan. We don't care about our individual politics. Our politics are our own business. You know, we are there to represent every single person affected by wildfire. We are strategic in using our time and who we invite to the table, and we are multi-sectored. So just in this photo, you have a supervisor from Napa, a supervisor from Mendocino, a council person from Paradise, and then a business person from Napa. So how do you do it? Again, this is kind of, if anybody wants to know and you want to come back and have another conversation with me where it isn't taking up that much time, you should have local elected leaders in the room. That's really important. Subject matter experts such as Larry is great with housing, and Margaret Van Vliet. Both of them we consider subject matter experts, and we've had them in the room. Larry, again, since 2017. And fire survivors, often you can get it's a subject matter expert that's also a fire survivor. So it depends on the issue. Like right now we're working on IRS rules for PG&E energy company settlements from the 2017 to 18 wildfires to make sure that there is no liability for the fire survivors. So we're using them in the room to talk to Congressman Thompson's office. Keep the group small. Be very, 40 people is not good for this. You want to keep it like, ideally about 7 people at most. 4, it really depends on what it is, but you don't want a big group. Bigger is not better with advocacy. Assign roles, practice ahead of time. How many times, what are you going to speak to specifically? How many minutes are you going to speak? Provide an agenda to the people speaking, but also where you're going. And that may sound obvious, but it's not really. Provide contact information and bios for everyone, and then we follow up with notes so that all parties agree on what it is that we spoke to, including action items. That always comes in handy. I just kind of put on the side over here, you can look at it at your own leisure, but this is basically our current platform. What specifically are we looking for? We don't want any surprises. We don't do any gotchas. If somebody's like super mad at an elected, we actually work that out on the side because we want to be very productive. We are advocates. We're not in there doing activism. We don't mind activism, but we just do it in a different way. Provide a clear and concise platform, target each element to the lawmaker or agency's purview. You don't want to go into FEMA talking about something that should be under FCC or EDA or something they could work with together. Don't be afraid to go in like all of Oregon. That's okay. They love that. It's a lot of bang for their buck. They're very excited about that. Ensure your platform is based in reality and informed by experience. So if you go in and you say that you want something that is just not in the realm of possibility, or they'd have to change, a third of all of the rules in FEMA, you're probably not going to get that. But for example, you go into FEMA and you say, we need the tree rule changed. We need you to actually take the trees out when you remove debris because you're leaving behind firewood. They are like, okay, we understand that. And that rule was changed in time for your fire. Ensure your platform. Remember that everything said and done is open to Freedom of Information Act request. So don't do anything that you don't want to be public knowledge, okay? Leverage relationships and cultivate cross-sector engagement. You want business leaders in the room. You want nonprofit leaders, public officials. You want a 360 view of recovery and rebuilding challenges. And remember, it's not the last trip you'll ever be on. So be very strategic. You see Larry is down there in that picture next to me, and behind him is Henry Hansel, who is a businessman, and beside him is a city manager. I see a city council person. Business people, anyway, so you get the idea. Cross-sector is great. Again, here's a meeting with Senator Feinstein, and then up at the top, that was with FEMA. And then below, you'll see that we run spreadsheets and we make sure that we really track everything. It does cost us about $20,000 per trip, and it's totally worth it. We don't benefit in any material way from any of these this, but that's one of our functions, is to provide that staff support, because to do it right is rather staff intensive. These are examples. I won't go too deeply into it, of things that we've done. As you can see, we are neither Republican nor Democrat. When we go in there, we are representing fire survivors, period. And whoever can get us across can help the issue. That's who we work with. since the pandemic, we've had to go virtual. And there you see Margaret. She usually smiles more than that. Sorry, Margaret, that's the picture I have. So I actually loved having the opportunity to have different people at the table. This is the chief of staff for, who's that? Oh, for Pelosi's office. So this is, and then we have Lake County at the table, Napa. We have a tribal leader, a business leader, and these things are very important again. And at the top though, it says, you know, this is a Facebook post. We're very transparent about what we do. We always say where we've been, exactly what we're talking about, and who was in the room. If you don't do that, then people will make, you know, they make up conspiracies about what's going on, and there's really nothing going on that's really that sexy. So this is what's going on. And basically, there were just some other links for you, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And go Oregon.
Yes. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for that. And I mean, I'm learning today how important that advocacy is. Right? It's just, I like the idea that, you know, we're helping train FEMA and HUD to handle wildfire in addition to the normal water and wind that they deal with.
One note for all of you,
yeah.
make sure you start talking about roads now with FEMA, because we're not going to get any money back for the damage to our roads from debris removal. Sorry, that's my creepy phone. And they said that we would about 5 years after. It doesn't look like we are. They've denied the county's claim, but just to know that you have to start looking at your roads now so that you know by the time that all the construction and debris removal is over that you have some kind of baseline.
Interesting. Okay. Go ahead,
Jennifer,
Alex.
what does that, what form does that take?
What form letting them know?
Yeah, well, what program I mean, what are we asking them to use to
Well,
address that?
you'd be probably working with ODOT and looking at the condition of the roads around all the wildfire areas, and then you'd be going back to FEMA and talking to them.
Sorry,
I'm not a subject matter expert in the exact grant, though. If I became a subject matter expert in all of that, I would crumple.
Right on.
I can't fit any more in my brain.
Thanks.
But I'm happy to work with you, Alex, if you want to do that, and to get help get you where you need to go. I'm happy to do that. We do remember we are in service to Oregon, just like we are California and Colorado.
Thank you.
That's great. Are there any questions from our audience? Okay, thank you, Jennifer. And now I want to have Karen join us and talk about kind of our local data that we've been pulling together around needs, you know, and unmet needs still in the community, and so that they may, you know, that data may help inform whatever applications and programs we decide to try to apply for block grants with. So Karen, go ahead.
Okay, let me get this loaded up and come back to you all. Okay, so these are the very, very preliminary results of our needs assessment survey. It's an overview of sort of the post-disaster needs, what remains after all of the resources have come through FEMA, private insurance, SBA, state support, and the like. And so it's not a summary of the value of items lost in the disaster, because the cost to replace those, as we've seen, are generally significantly higher than the value of the lost items. And so we undertook this effort at the end or in the middle of 2021. We could start to understand what survivors would need. And historically, these needs assessments are conducted by an organization, World Renew, and because of the pandemic, it precluded them from coming out here to do that. Our understanding is that even with things like Hurricane Sandy, the volume of assessments that they typically do were like 900, right? And so we were in a position to innovate. And so we innovated the first ever online needs assessment that could be conducted through telephone interviews or in person instead of the paper format that has historically been used. And so we administered this survey with a number of our organizational partners, Rogue Climate, Rogue Action Center, Zone Captains, UNATE, and United Way, and others. And so we conducted them between July 2021 and into the beginning of this year, January 2022. Again, they were conducted in person and remotely based on the comfort of the survivor. These interviews can be incredibly emotionally taxing. And so we want to make sure that we were providing a safe space for survivors to tell us their story. Extensive efforts were made to ensure that a diverse set of survivors were interviewed to reflect the impacted community. If anything, we oversampled in marginalized communities because we knew that they were going to have the hardest time recovering. Race and ethnicity were not collected during this survey process. We did, however, have the ability to capture language preference based on the partner that was conducting the surveys. So we had a total of 419 households that were surveyed. 39% of those surveys were conducted with Spanish-speaking households. And you can see the breakdowns in here. Insurance, no surprise, contributed significantly to survivors' ability to recover. Folks that had insurance received larger settlements than folks without it, but there's still this sort of schism between being underinsured, right? And so we know that's a very real challenge that folks are facing. We also saw that, at the time of the interview, quite a few of our survivors had large portions of their benefits still remaining to help with their recovery. And I think some of this is reflective of our sampling methodologies. We interviewed quite a few folks that were still in emergency sheltering. And so they were able to hold on to their funds as they're being supported through shelter structures and the mass feeding program through Rogue Food Unites. So the types of homes and the ownership status, more than half of survivors lived in manufactured homes. And more than half of the survivors owned their homes. A high percentage of Spanish-speaking households owned their homes. We also know that there were high rates of uninsurance or underinsurance because of multiple competing financial considerations. We also know that the age of impacted manufactured homes a lot of them were pre-1979. And so as others on this call mentioned, we can't replace those, right? I can't replace a $15,000 manufactured home. And so now we are faced with escalating costs to purchase and what that's going to look like as we try to move folks back into their communities. Single wide manufactured homes were generally older. And they're highly represented in the 1979 and older community. So most fire impacted households reported low or moderate incomes. I believe roughly about 93% of the Spanish speaking households that we interviewed had incomes less than $40,000. For our English speaking households, it was about 83%. Household sizes were small, anywhere from 1 to 2. But we also know that you had multi-generational households that maybe would not have reported in the way that we would have traditionally captured. So that is another caveat in this data. And then for outcomes, every survivor that was interviewed, their information was forwarded to a disaster case manager, and all survivors have been contacted by a disaster case manager for intake and tiering And so they've either been connected or they are in line to be set up with case management services. A full report is in process. We will have that probably out in the next month or two. We want to share it with the survivors so that they can see what we're understanding from the data that they provided us with, and then add any concerns or additional considerations they want to make clear in that data. And then it's going to be used for the basis for future grant requests. So that is the long and short of our needs assessment data to date. We have over 100 pages of qualitative data. The stories are heart-wrenching in a lot of cases. I can't overestimate the emotional toll that this took on survivors to provide us with this information, and for the interviewers who conducted these interviews, some of whom were survivors themselves. And so we are running that qualitative data through partners with SOU, some retired, some current, so that we can get that rich storytelling that Jennifer spoke so highly of earlier, so that it's not just numbers. These are real stories. And these are people. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I've been working a little bit on this deck as well, and there are 100 slides right now. We will pare it down from that, but that's just charts. So this data, there's a lot of data, and it's being sliced and diced in a variety of ways. And then there's a lot of qualitative as well. So that it will be an interesting set of tools for the community to use to kind of tell their stories. So thank you, Karen, for that. Any questions? Anybody? Okay, well, this has been super informative time. Is there anyone else who would, I just want to, the floor is open. Please raise your hand or just jump in. Go ahead, Kathy. Yeah.
Karen, just for my bad memory, how many actual survivors have been interviewed?
It was 419 households.
So 419 households, okay.
Yeah, so there were a couple of duplications. So we managed to reduce that down. I think Barry would know the precise number of surveys that were conducted, but we eliminated duplications and it's down to, I believe, 419
Right.
at this point.
And were those people ones that were reached out to and people who were somehow housed temporarily or housed by the state?
Yeah, so a lot of our partners reached back out to survivors they had been in contact with, right? So the RAC had their fire relief center, which was a really great point there. The United Way had their list of folks who had reached out for fire relief funds. And so they were able to go back into that list and recruit responses and participation from there. UNITE, similarly, all of these partners really reached back into the communities that have trusted them. And I think that for me is the power of the LTRG, right? It's a coalition of partners that are leveraging their relationships to make sure that the survivor stories are getting told so that we can make them whole in whatever way we are able to in the positions that we are honored to hold.
And so the 419 households, does that include then the households that UNITE interviewed, which were somewhere around 500, I think was said earlier tonight?
No, I would clarify with them, but this one is more specifically like there may be some overlap, but this is more specifically like, tell us how many windows you lost at the same time that we ask you the most intrusive question, which is, what was your greatest loss? And so it's quite a robust data set. And complements the other surveys that were done.
Didn't each of these surveys take 2 or 3 hours to conduct? I mean, is that true?
No, I think when we first tried to do it, I think it took us about an hour and a half. we had some very patient folks that beta tested it with us in the beginning. But we got it down to what, half an hour?
I mean,
Or
even
Eli
just saying
said-
an hour and a half for theirs, and yeah, so I think it depends, and I heard also they were quite conversational in some cases, right? It wasn't just filling out a survey. So Carmel, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, hi, I'm Carmel Snyder with ARP Oregon. And Karen, I was just wondering if you all took age demographics when you did the surveys. I know a lot of what you're saying, it resonates with us in the survey we released earlier this month, and the one we're going to debrief tomorrow on it as well, but it sounds very similar in the findings.
Yeah, and so we were able to capture age demographics in that. I think one of the things that the population that we had the hardest time getting a representative sample on were site-built homeowners, right? Stick-built homeowners, because the sense was that what we heard frequently was that, oh, I don't need anything because there's people with more needs than me. And so they wouldn't step forward for fear that they were taking resources from someone else. But we do have it stratified by age, and we have a pretty good representation of 65 and older, which I think AARP is 55 and older. So we have that breakout.
50 and older, but you can join whenever.
I know I get invitations because I've come to some of your webinars and I'm like, guys, I still have some time.
Right. And yeah, I'm glad to hear that we're starting to get some kind of resonance between the sets of data, and that hopefully will head us in the right direction and let us know we're on track. Dawn, do you have a question?
Well, I was going to ask a similar question in terms of the profile, because having delivered meals in the area in a lot of those parks that were wiped out, those were primarily older people. And I think what you said is correct, fixed income and stuff. So I was just curious what percentage, but I'd be interested in seeing that data.
Yeah, and so we're breaking it down into these pots. We've heard repeatedly from the state, from ODHS, that about 89.6% of survivors were on some form of public assistance. So that's everything from WIC and SNAP and TANF to Social Security, disability, and the like. And so we want to be really mindful of making sure that was really sought after, was making sure that we were getting a representative sample, aware that so many of the folks that were disproportionately impacted were going to be from marginalized and underserved communities.
So, thank you.
Yeah,
and actually saying that they were in mobile homes is maybe not a correct statement. We can remember some of them were in literally travel trailers,
yeah,
and using a wheelchair, and
yeah,
then having to transfer to another wheelchair once they got outside. Yeah.
yeah.
So it's, yeah, thank you.
And that's the sense of this, right? All of these surveys, all of this data that we have all worked so tirelessly to gather over the past 18 months is really going to come together to help inform our planning processes, right? And so the LTRG is spearheading the community recovery planning process. And so we're going to have a meeting next week to sort of rescope that work and what it will look like 18 months as opposed to just a couple months out from disaster, and then figure out a way to provide that connective tissue between the current existing planning efforts and future planning efforts in a way that supports our survivors finding home wherever they land, because we know that what we lost is not necessarily what we need.
Oh, yeah, that was really interesting, Larry. We mentioned that same thing, right? We can't build back the $15,000 40-year-old mobile home.
Okay.
And we don't necessarily want to, right? If it's not accessible, et cetera. So Kathy, you posed a really interesting question that maybe our guests can help us answer about how do we present this data to the federal government in a compelling way? Is N equals 419 enough? And how do we show correspondence between, census data and other things to say, yes, we have a representative sample here?
And remember, for Hurricane Sandy, when World Renew did their sampling, 900. They did 900 surveys. So for our population, which we've estimated between, I don't know, the numbers vacillate between 6,000 and 10,000 folks were displaced. We got 419 surveys. So our N is comparably good.
I think if the question is being posed, I think it's important to bring the personal stories in, as you've already talked about. There's not, and others have alluded to this, that the programs are really not set up for wildfires. They are adapting them because of the reality of what they're dealing with now in Washington in terms of funding disasters on the West Coast. But it really was important to bring this home to on the personal level, so that they could understand what the issues were that we were struggling with, in order for them to make their rules that will just baffle your mind in terms of their Byzantine bureaucracy and the way that they're written. And you just got to get to the right people at the agencies with the stories that show them why it doesn't work, the way that they're trying to allocate the funds.
Mm-hmm. And that's great, thank you. And it sounds like that's kind of what some of Jennifer's advocacy work is about as well, right? It's to get the right story at the right moment to the right person who can adjust the program. And then, and sorry if I missed the thrust of your question, Kathy, about how anymore, we heard that it's important to leverage the funds and to find these extra pockets. Is there any advice about how we can go about doing that?
Well, one of the things we did, as I mentioned, was we were able to identify this other source of funding for housing called the 9% disaster tax credits. I would absolutely advocate in your case that there be another allocation. We actually, this was a program that was set up in 2002 to deal with probably Hurricane Katrina. And then Senator McConnell got it reallocated in 2005 for a disaster in Kentucky, and then no one had used it since then. And so absolutely go in there and advocate for those disaster credits. We actually are leveraging on the 3 projects we are building right now using DR funding. I think we're leveraging them 7 times in order to get the projects actually built. And there's a combination of fund. Most of it is the tax credits, and then there's the CDBG-GR, and then we cobble together other home programs and other existing sources to try to leverage those funds.
Yeah, and I think in the, the state has, OHCS has really quite robust housing development resources right now. And, there's some complexities, but there are ways to leverage funds. People may have heard of the LIFT program, for example, and some of the wildfire funds that the legislature has appropriated. And then these ARPA funds that are flowing both to the state and to local municipalities, right? So the capital stack is in Oregon isn't going to be as complex as what Larry's got. We're escalating fast, but we're not at Bay Area prices for constructing multifamily affordable. But it's, this is what developers have to figure out how to do, is kind of organize these capital stacks to get buildings built. We've got a lot of, development capacity in Oregon, and certainly in Southern Oregon. The trade-off is going to be building those multifamily units, which there was already a huge need for, and recognizing that a lot of what I think the community wants to rebuild is not multifamily. It's detached, recreate parks if we can. And how do you assemble capital for that is, I think, really our challenge in the Rogue Valley in a different way. But yeah, if there's the, I don't know the current, I know we've got some disaster credits, Alex. Maybe you can speak to that. So I'm not current on any of that stuff, but if there's a way to position them so that they really work for what is needed and prioritize in your community, that's going to be the trick of it, I think.
There was an allocation and a sub-allocation by county, and the Housing Authority of Jackson County does have some in one of the projects that they're working on. And it sounds like there may be an opportunity in future rounds to seek more.
Right.
This is amazing. As you say, I like the idea of a capital stack. And it's quite astounding, really, in the state of Oregon, what we have in Southern Oregon, what we have coming at us. I mean, that Alex represented in the beginning. My question now, and Alex was way ahead on this, months and months ago, he said, land availability is going to be the key question. Where will we build all of this? Because we have urban growth boundaries, right? And so it can't all be infill. That's going to be a really interesting challenge for our community over the coming months is, where will we build?
You also have 4 jurisdictions, which makes it more complicated. You have, Medford, Phoenix, Talent, all incorporated, plus then the county. So it's we'll be watching and learning. I don't have any perfect insight into that, but that can be a difficult one if you're looking at a cohesive strategy. And to remind you that Fannie Mae, we brought them in when I showed up there a month after your disasters. They're very interested. They own 4 parks there. I was just there 2 months ago and I checked on their parks. We do scope of work for them. They are a great partner though, and they will look to see how they can actually change their policies to hopefully match some of your needs, which they did do in 2021. Is come up with a mortgage product that allows for non-chattel loans, single family, same rate as a single family home, which is a huge difference and a path to home ownership and wealth by buying shares of a mobile home park. So if they have given a presentation, we have one on our YouTube channel, the same one. We just did another one with them. So please do use them because they are interested in what you do. And we are not the gatekeepers of that relationship. We are happy to pass it off. We're happy to facilitate it, whatever it is that you need.
That's great. Thank you, Jennifer. And Kathy, do you want to ask your question? I think you can ask it faster than I can read it.
Well, again, going back to Larry and the,
Yeah, I was
chain. Yeah, so sorry.
Starting to type you an answer, so why don't I just give it to you verbally instead?
Yeah, that's great.
Rather than try to send. It was a complex. In fact, it took us a year to come to the determination that it made sense to rebuild, not to rebuild it as a mobile home park, but as a senior housing. So, and actually, there's going to be affordable and market rate housing. This was 13 acres. That was the park consisted of. 3 of those acres are going to be the senior affordable housing. That's what's underway. And then 270 of them are going to be rental market rate units that are necessary. So we're replacing 160 units with 420 in a incredibly housing constrained environment. It is in a little bit of a way to see unicorn in that it's an urban infill. It's a classic urban infill site. It's surrounded by a hospital, by a freeway. It's got shopping right next to it. So it sort of, if you were to open up your ULI or other planning books, you'd say this is urban infill, and this is the opportunity. The other determining factor, 2 others, which were on the human level. One was that the destruction was so bad to the infrastructure of the park that it would have cost way more to rebuild the infrastructure in some ways. It would have cost a ton to rebuild the infrastructure, and there weren't sources for that really on the private land. And the other reason was because most of the folks who had been displaced would not have been able to move back. They wouldn't have been able to afford to buy mobile homes to move back into the park. Somebody earlier said these were mobile homes that had been there for 20, 30, 40 years. Some of them had values of maybe $10,000, $20,000 at most. And new mobile homes to qualify for the parks would be about $150,000 plus and up. And these were folks on fixed income. So the only opportunity really for these people to come in would be to come into a subsidized affordable housing project. I do have to say that the 160 who are displaced, we don't expect more than 25 or 30 of the families or the individuals to move into the affordable project, frankly, because most of them moved on. They've moved out of the area. or they've had to, make other plans at this point. But even for those 30 that are able to move back, I can't tell you how excited they are to be able to finally move back to their homes, even if it looks different.
Do you know if was it a private landowner, and did the city
Yeah.
and or county have to buy out the landowner, and how did that actually work?
So as private landowner, we actually bought out the landowner. And again, the tax credits that we were able to get were critical in being able to, we went to close on the land. So we bought him out.
Okay, okay.
Hmm.
That's,
I'm so glad that you were able to make that happen, Larry. It's amazing. It's great. It's a great outcome. And, it just reminds me that disasters are really gentrifying events. It takes out this naturally occurring low income housing, and it's almost impossible to replace it without huge subsidy. So I'm glad you were able to do that on those 162 units. Well, we are right at time. This has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate everybody who contributed to this. And I just look forward to continuing this work and these conversations in the months to come. We'll let you know as things as we schedule our next one. If you have any ideas, let us know for what you'd like to hear about. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Alex? Go ahead.
Yeah, Stephen, I just mentioned that I put the link back in the chat. Not only is the survey there, but there's a sign up to get regular updates on the development of DR. So if you want to track that, please sign up.
That's great. Yes, and we've been recording, obviously, and we will post that in the coming days, along with all the chat and all the links and all the decks and all of that. So because there's so much data in today's meeting, it's a heavy load today. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
And blessings. See you soon.
Thanks, Stephen.